Hello, gentlemen, and welcome back to our discussions on consecrated life, on religious life. One thing that I probably should point out is the reason why, when we talk about consecrated life, when we talk about religious life, the reason why it's called that. So, consecrated, again, it's from the Latin secare, meaning to cut or to separate. To be consecrated is to be separated apart with. So, with, secare, separated. To be consecrated is to be set apart with God, essentially. And when we talk about religious life, the life of the vows, the question might become, well, why isn't everybody? Isn't everybody supposed to be religious if you're Catholic? Yes. The origin of the word literally with religion. So first of all, the word religion only referred to, at first, people who had entered an order, people who had taken vows, because it's from re legio. It's from a second law or a second reading. In other words, with religious life, there is an additional rule of pattern that one lives by in addition to simply the Gospels. And then over time, this phrase that was originally only for the vowed life began to be applied to all Christians and then all forms of organized spirituality, let's say. So this is why we talk about religious life or consecrated life. When we left off yesterday, we had been talking about the beginnings of religious life, why it was that people first wanted to take those vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And fundamentally, with the vows, it is about looking forward to how it is that we are going to exist at the end times. It's what's called an eschatological witness, from the term eschatology, the end times. The eschaton is the last day in Greek. So that when we take those vows of poverty, of chastity, and obedience, we acknowledge that when Jesus comes, we will neither be married nor given in marriage, and hence chastity. We will not have anything to call our own. Everything, our total support comes not from my own strength, but from God when I'm in heaven. So poverty. And my will perfectly be conformed to God's. So obedience. In making these vows, the idea is the vowed religious looks forward to how we are going to live one day and says, I want to witness to this and I want to remind people of what that's going to look like now. With the Benedictine order and with its reforms, with the Cistercians and with the Trappists, we have seen the beginnings of religious life. However, this is not the end of the story, but merely the beginning. And so this takes us to the Middle Ages, this takes us to the 1200s, where there are further developments in living out religious and consecrated life. After the monasteries come what are known as the Mendicant orders. So we have the monastic beginnings and then the Mendicant continuations. Mendicant, it's from the Latin word essentially that means to beg alms. And as we're going to see, this is a major difference between the monastic life and the mendicant life. Monasteries tended to be out in the countryside. Remember, they began as desert enclosures, places where people would go out to live, usually in groups of 12, out in the desert or somewhere out in the wilderness, in the forest, and they would live a stable life. Mendicants are individuals who go out and they beg their alms, whereas the monasteries are supposed to be self-sufficient and stable. Mendicants try and live a life essentially of holy instability. Foxes have dens, birds have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to rest his head. This was the major impulse. And so if you're going to be begging alms, if you're going to be begging your daily bread, you're going to need to be in a town center. And this is one of the major things that mendicants were also trying to address. Mendicants ultimately begin their rise in the 13th century, in the 1200s. One of the major social changes that was occurring in the 13th century, this is really the beginnings of the High Middle Ages. The 1100s, the 1200s, the 1300s, this is the High Middle Ages. And urban centers, the great cities of medieval Europe, are really coming into their own. And so with the rise of urban centers in the Middle Ages, the church is going to need to adapt so that our religious centers are no longer out in the countryside or out in the desert, but in the thick of things and where the people are. And so then from here, we have the Mendicant orders. And in particular, the four great Mendicant orders were all founded in the 1200s. First, we have the Carmelites, founded in 1206. We have the Franciscans, founded a few years later in 1209. The Dominicans, who, as we're going to see, are very close cousins to the Franciscans, founded in 1215, and then finally the Augustinians, founded in 1244. The Franciscans and the Dominicans have certain things that they share in their own heritage, and the Carmelites and Augustinians likewise have certain things that they have in common. So that as we take a look at these orders, as we look at mendicant life, we're going to look next at the Franciscans and Dominicans, and then after this, we're going to look at the Carmelites and Augustinians together. So we have a shared legacy of the Dominicans and the Franciscans. And there's a great tradition that St. Dominic and St. Francis actually both knew one another and had met a few times. The Dominicans were founded as a response to a particular heresy known as the Albigensians. Dominic was originally a priest. He was a bishop's secretary, so he was a regular diocesan priest. And as he was going around, he was seeing that there was this heresy all over the place that just kept on popping up time and time and time again. And Dominic was appalled at the way in which the diocesan clergy, the clergy who were assigned to the parishes and the dioceses, were attempting to deal with it. Essentially, one of the problems was that the priests were not very well intellectually formed. Now remember, prior to the Council of Trent, there was not the requirement of 6 years of seminary, 2 years of philosophy, 4 of theology, prior to being ordained. This was very much a development of the Council of Trent. It was theoretically possible that a priest had little to no formal education, even in matters of theology. So that Dominic was absolutely appalled at the intellectual formation of the clergy. What he decided to do then, because he wasn't able to just rewrite how all priests are trained everywhere, he said, I want to do something different. I want to raise up a group of priests who are intellectually well trained, and they have a dedication to the intellectual life, and they are also going to be excellent preachers. Hence, the official name of the Dominicans is the Order of Preachers, or the Order of Friars Preachers. And so what these Dominicans do, the whole idea of the Order of Preachers, they are individuals who are learned men who know very well skills in oratory and rhetoric and how to really make a good point, not only merging style and substance. This is key. You have to have the substance there, so there's the intellectual formation, but then also there's a certain art to public speaking. So you have the style as well. Dominic really wanted this. He wanted skillful and learned preachers to better combat these heresies, to better combat the misconceptions, and to really help people grow in their faith. And this is showing us in many ways how the church as herald ought to live. And not only should these preachers be learned and be skilled preachers, but Dominic was convinced we need to be preaching in poverty. By the witness of our lives, we will show people that we actually mean what it is that we say. And so Dominic could think of no other way to have this group of priests than to take on the existing format of religious vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience and say, we're living that too, but we're going to live it in a different way. Our poverty is going to be a new and radical form of poverty, very similar to what my dear brother St. Francis has done. We are going to beg for our alms. We are going to beg for our sustenance every day instead of living in stable monasteries. And because they are preachers, they're going to be going from town to town, so that you no longer then have a religious order where you will join a place with the expectation, okay, I've entered the monastery of Monte Cassino, I've entered Monte Cassino Abbey, I've entered the Abbey of Regina Laudis as a nun perhaps, and I'm going to spend my life there. If you join the Dominican order, you could be sent anywhere to go and to preach the gospel and to preach it convincingly in poverty. And this is why Dominic had the mendicant structure of the order that he did. Francis likewise. Francis wanted to really experience a radical form of poverty where, just like Jesus, he did not know where tomorrow's meal was going to come from. I've told you in the previous section about G.K. Chesterton's wonderful biography of Francis of Assisi. I really do strongly recommend you read it. One of the things that Chesterton noted about St. Francis was he had a beautiful image of how St. Francis would fling himself in one situation after another. he would fling himself into this, he would fling himself into that, he would fling himself into his mission to the Middle East to try and preach to the Sultan to bring peace. And the more and more he flung himself into this or that situation, the more and more he would learn the feel of God's hand, because as he would fling himself, he trusted God's hand is going to catch me. And so Francis, in flinging himself into these situations, learns the feel of God's hand and knows what it is to be cared for by God. And so this is why Francis wants his own friars to have a mendicant sort of life. And the Dominicans and the Franciscans were founded at roughly the same time, and in a sense, they have complementary missions. There are, with the works of mercy, there are the spiritual works of mercy and the corporal works of mercy. The spiritual works of mercy are things like instructing the ignorant, admonishing the sinner, counseling the doubtful. The corporal works of mercy, of course, are things like sheltering those who are hungry, feeding those who are hungry, giving water to those who are thirsty, visiting the imprisoned, all of these things. And so we can say that the Dominicans very much do the spiritual works of mercy. The Franciscans engage in the corporal works of mercy. These two orders very much need each other. In a sense, they're two sides of the same coin. And their respect and their mutual history for one another is so great that Dominicans have a special feast day for the Franciscan feasts and for the feast of Francis of Assisi, and the Franciscans likewise honor the Dominicans with various Dominican feasts. And each of them, so there's a tradition usually in any one order, you will speak of the founder as our Holy Father so-and-so. So in Jesuit lingo, we might talk of our Holy Father Ignatius. Dominicans will not only talk of our Holy Father Dominic, but of our Holy Father Francis. Franciscans will talk not only of our Holy Father Francis, but of our Holy Father Dominic, in recognition that Francis and Dominic in some ways founded two different orders, in some ways founded two sides of one order, two branches of one beautiful symbiosis, two groups that really do need one another. Ultimately, what we have are convents of friars, so no longer monasteries, but convents, sometimes also called priories, Priory. And this is a term derived from the Benedictines of something too small to be an abbey. So you have convents or priories full of friars. And now, if you're a member of a mendicant order, you're a friar. This, by the way, is the difference between a monk and a friar. A monk lives in a monastery. A friar is a member of a mendicant order. Monks and nuns, monastic orders, friars and sisters, mendicant orders. So you're no longer tied to one monastery. You're going to go from place to place to preach and to beg alms and to care for the poor and to do whatever it is that you need to do. Thomas Aquinas is going to see this as a blending of there's a part of it that's contemplative. So the Dominicans and the Franciscans are contemplating truth, and then not only are they praying about this, but then they're going out into the world and they're doing it. So it's a blend of contemplation and of action. And then we have two other groups. We have the Augustinians and the Carmelites. They have a slightly different origin in that with both the Augustinians and the Carmelites, there were groups that had formed independently of one another. So we've got a convent here, another group there, and we decide to join them all together. In the case of the Augustinians, you have groups spread all throughout Europe and North Africa who were following the ancient rule of St. Augustine. So St. Augustine, from the 4th century, wrote a guideline for how to live a monastic life, how to live religious life. And in fact, the Dominicans also use the rule of St. Augustine in creating their own religious life. So you had all of these convents forming up around Europe, and they were all using the rule of St. Augustine. And eventually the Pope said, I think it would be better if everybody is gathered under one roof, just so we can have a little bit more organization. Now, the Augustinians are sometimes also known as the Austin Friars. Austin is kind of a corruption of Augustine, or the Grey Friars. As you can see, their habit is kind of a grayish sort of a hue. And this sort of ersatz combination of the Augustinians is also why you have communities of Augustinians that will sometimes look wildly different from one another. And is also why in some places you have convents, in other places you have priories, other places monasteries, and there is even exactly one Augustinian abbey in the world. That abbey is actually where Gregor Mendel, the father of modern genetics, lived and worked. And in fact, if you look down there, you see there is Gregor Mendel. He wasn't just a monk in that abbey. Gregor Mendel was an abbot in that abbey. And so you see him with the pectoral cross, with the mitre, with the crozier. Gregor Mendel is probably among the most famous of the Augustinian monks. Technically so was Martin Luther. He was an Augustinian monk. But Gregor Mendel is the most famous Augustinian monk that stayed an Augustinian monk. Luther, of course, left his order to found Lutheranism. The Carmelites were a group of individuals who were living in various desert places, especially in Egypt. And eventually the Pope said again, it seems like it would be a good idea for all of you to be grouped under one rule. And so in the late 1200s, all of these various Carmelite orders, and their desert origins are probably why they have a more brown-looking habit. So you can see above, again, oftentimes when you have a male and female branch of an order, the men's habit and the women's habit are going to look nearly identical. Really, the only difference is men have a hood, women have a veil. Other than that, it's the same. And so you have down below, you have St. Simon Stock and some of the other early Carmelites. And so they will likewise, they're going to go out, they're going to beg for their alms, they're going to be doing spiritual works and be generally active. Now, the Carmelites were a little more on the contemplative side in balancing out active and contemplative ministries, but they were still very much mendicant continuations. And a Carmelite friar or a Carmelite sister might very well go from one convent to another, one place to another, rather than that life of stability which a monastic would tend more to expect. So these are the mendicant orders. And as you can imagine, the mendicant orders also had a great deal of influence on the Jesuits. I had mentioned yesterday that when Ignatius was reading the life of Christ, it was by a Carthusian. And so there was a Carthusian influence. In addition to which, when Ignatius was reading about the lives of the saints, Ignatius was very much inspired by the life of St. Dominic and the life of St. Francis. He found him very often asking himself, after he would read the lives of the saints, what would St. Dominic do in this situation? Or what would St. Francis do in this situation? So it's a spirituality with the Jesuits. It's a spirituality inspired by the prayer life of the Carthusians, but then the active life of the Dominicans and the Franciscans, as well as the intellectual life of the Dominicans. And the Jesuits likewise have a tradition. We aren't called mendicants technically, but the way of Jesuit living poverty and the way Ignatius originally envisioned Jesuit poverty is absolutely inspired by the mendicant way of life and the mendicant tradition of living on your alms from day to day, begging your alms, preaching in poverty, and that dedication to the intellectual life. All of this then is going to come to a head. All of these forms of religious life are going to really inform this next wave of religious development that's going to happen around the 1500s in the lead up to and the immediate aftermath to the Protestant Reformation. So tomorrow we're going to take a look at religious life following the Council of Trent. Below in the description, I have a little vocations video for the Dominicans. This is for the West Coast Dominicans. I actually studied with many of these individuals when I was studying out in Berkeley. I actually took a lot of my classes out at the Dominican school. The priory down there, St. Albert's Priory, is a place I know and love. Spent many masses, many hours in prayer out there. Check it out and see, what is it like to live and preach in poverty dedicated to the intellectual life? Have a good day, gentlemen, and keep up your own dedication to that intellectual life.